The CEO said the black farmer's son to fix the machine. He had no idea who his father was. Long before the headlines, the outrage, and the viral video that would shake the corporate world, there was just a quiet 19-year-old named Jordan Carter, a farmer's son whose story began far from boardrooms and billion-dollar machines. He lived in Fairview County, a place where the days started before the sun and where hands got rough before they got old. The Carter farm sat at the edge of town, surrounded by endless fields of golden wheat that swayed like waves under the morning breeze. From a distance, it looked peaceful, but beneath that calm was a story waiting to be told. Jordan's mornings always started the same. Long before most of the town woke up, he was already outside, tightening bolts on an irrigation pump or greasing the old tractor his father had rebuilt from scrap. He wasn't just good with machines, he understood them. His father used to say that every piece of metal had a heartbeat if you learned to listen closely enough. And Jordan listened. His father, David Carter, had once been one of the country's most brilliant engineers, a visionary who designed automation systems for some of the biggest tech firms in the nation. But years ago, something had gone wrong. Contracts were broken, credit was stolen, and a man named Edward Langston, then just an ambitious executive, had walked away with everything David built. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share a word of love in the comments. David never told the full story, but Jordan had pieced together enough. He knew that his father's designs had made someone else rich. He knew that betrayal had turned his father away from the world of corporations. And he knew that, ever since then, David had preferred the quiet honesty of the fields to the noise of boardrooms. Their farmhouse was small, but it was alive with invention. In one corner stood shelves of farm tools. In another, a workbench littered with circuit boards and blueprints. David had turned their barn into a kind of hidden workshop, part mechanics garage, part engineering lab. Jordan spent countless nights there, watching his father solve problems that people twice his age couldn't even identify. He absorbed everything. His mother, Angela Carter, was the glue that held them together. For 12 years, she'd worked as a legal assistant at Neotech Manufacturing, one of the largest industrial tech companies in the country. She was efficient, reliable, and invisible, the kind of employee who kept everything running but never got credit for it. In meetings, people often talked over her. In hallways, they forgot her name. She never complained. But some nights, when she came home and thought no one was watching, Jordan would see her pause at the doorway, shoulders heavy, eyes distant, as if carrying the quiet weight of a world that never saw her worth. Still, the Carters were a proud family. They believed in humility, in hard work, and in the kind of dignity that couldn't be bought. Their farm didn't make them rich, but it gave them purpose. And Jordan, though young, carried that same quiet strength. On the morning that changed everything, the air was still cool with the last breath of night. Angela had already left early for work. She mentioned something about an emergency meeting at Neotech. In her rush, she'd forgotten a folder of legal contracts she was supposed to deliver to the CEO's office. "Take it to her," David said, handing the folder to his son. "But don't stay long. The city eats time faster than a broken combine." Jordan smiled, wiped the grease from his hands, and climbed into his old pickup truck. He didn't know that this ordinary errand would lead him straight into the heart of the storm. The drive to Neotech headquarters was a quiet one. 45 minutes of winding roads that transformed from dirt to asphalt, from farmland to the gleaming skyline of industry. The Neotech complex stood like a monument to wealth. Glass towers reflecting sunlight, electric gates, and the company's silver logo glinting like a crown at the entrance. When Jordan walked through those glass doors, the contrast was blinding. Inside, everything was sleek and polished, marble floors, white walls, digital displays tracking production numbers in real time. Everyone moved fast, dressed in suits and precision. Jordan, in his worn jeans and oil-stained boots, looked out of place. But he carried himself with quiet confidence. He was there for one reason only: to deliver the folder. He passed through the lobby and headed toward the administrative offices. But before he could reach the reception desk, a sudden buzz filled the air, the kind of collective murmur that follows bad news. Through the wide glass panels separating the offices from the factory floor, he could see a commotion brewing inside the main production hall. Technicians rushed back and forth. Supervisors barked into radios. A group of engineers huddled around a towering piece of machinery that had gone silent. A massive, state-of-the-art assembly unit that was supposed to be Neotech's pride and profit. But now it sat dead. Jordan overheard fragments of conversation as he passed. The machine had been down for 3 weeks. The company was losing $600,000 every day. They had flown in experts from Japan, hired consultants from NASA, even brought in retired professors, yet no one could fix it. And at the center of it all stood Edward Langston, billionaire, founder, CEO, the same man who had built an empire out of other people's ideas, including, unknowingly, one belonging to the man whose son now stood quietly by the door. Edward was furious. His voice thundered across the hall as he demanded answers. Every eye in the room was on him. Trembling engineers, sweating managers, silent assistants. Then suddenly his gaze shifted toward the glass wall. He noticed Jordan standing there. A young black man in dusty boots, holding an envelope, watching. For a split second, the CEO smirked. Then came the words that would ignite everything. "Maybe the farmer's boy can fix it." The crowd laughed. Jordan didn't. He simply lowered his eyes, placed the envelope on a nearby table, and sent a text that would change everything. "Dad, it's time." Somewhere in the quiet countryside, David Carter looked down at his phone, and for the first time in years, smiled. Because this time, the stage was his. The moment Edward Langston's voice echoed across the warehouse, the entire production floor froze. The CEO's words weren't just an insult, they were entertainment. The laughter that followed rolled through the air like a wave of cruelty, bouncing off the steel walls and settling deep in Jordan's chest. Jordan didn't react. He stood there quietly, the envelope still in his hand, eyes calm. The same eyes that had studied broken engines and stubborn soil since childhood. He had seen storms before, both in weather and in people. Edward, however, mistook silence for weakness. He stepped closer, his expensive shoes clicking against the concrete. "Go on, son," he said with mock encouragement. "Since your folks are so good with dirt, maybe you can work some of your farm magic on our machine." More laughter. Some forced, some genuine. It didn't matter, the damage was done. Every smirk, every chuckle was another reminder that, in their eyes, Jordan didn't belong there. Among the sea of faces, one person didn't laugh. Dr. Emily Zhang, Neotech's chief engineer, watched from behind a clipboard, her expression tightening with each word. She knew what this was. Not a joke, but humiliation disguised as humor. She wanted to speak up, to stop it, but the chain of command at Neotech was suffocating. People who challenged Edward rarely lasted long. Jordan's phone buzzed again in his pocket. He glanced down briefly. A message from his father. "Proceed." That single word was enough. He turned toward Edward with a composed nod. "If it's all right," he said softly, "I'd be happy to take a look." The crowd fell momentarily quiet. A hush of disbelief. Edward crossed his arms, amused. "Be my guest, engineer." A ripple of snickers followed as Jordan walked across the floor, his boots echoing against the polished concrete. He stopped before the massive steel structure that had cost more than most small towns. Its surface shimmered with cold precision. A machine so advanced it required code and calibration beyond what most engineers could handle. Jordan scanned the control panel, eyes flicking across the readings. Within seconds, he noticed discrepancies, minor fluctuations in pressure and voltage alignment that didn't belong. The others had missed it because they were looking too high, too complex. Jordan saw the problem hidden in plain sight. He looked around for tools. "I'll need a Phillips screwdriver," he said. A few workers hesitated, unsure if he was serious. Then Emily, almost on instinct, stepped forward and handed him one. She wasn't sure why she trusted him. Maybe it was the calm certainty in his tone. Jordan crouched beside the machine, unfastened a panel, and reached for the flashlight. Every movement was measured, deliberate. The room fell silent, curiosity slowly replacing ridicule. Minutes ticked by. Beads of sweat rolled down Jordan's temple, reflecting the harsh industrial lights. Then, with a soft hum, the machine flickered to life. Gears aligned. Pistons rotated. The LED display, dark for weeks, began glowing a steady green. The silence that followed was louder than any laughter that had come before. Edward blinked, confused. What did you just do?" Jordan stood, wiped his hands on his jeans, and spoke evenly. The pressure sensor was calibrated for an Asian power standard. It created a voltage mismatch that caused an automatic system freeze. "I just reset it to local parameters." Emily's eyes widened. That was exactly the issue she and her team had failed to identify. An error buried deep in the machine's original design. "You cheated," Edward barked, his pride wounded. "Someone must have told you what was wrong." Jordan looked at him steadily. "No one did, sir. It was obvious, if you knew what to look for." The room stayed silent. Dozens of eyes darted between the CEO and the young man he had just humiliated. The irony hung heavy in the air. The farmer's boy had just done what teams of experts couldn't. Jordan's phone vibrated again. Another message appeared on the screen. "Arriving in 15 minutes. Prepare everything. DC." He looked up at Edward and asked quietly, "Mr. Langston, are you sure you want to keep going down this road?" Edward frowned. "Excuse me?" Jordan didn't answer. He simply pocketed his phone and stepped aside as the machine continued to run flawlessly. Whispers began to spread through the hall. Employees exchanged glances, phones came out, and someone started recording. In a company obsessed with hierarchy, this moment, a teenager outsmarting the CEO's entire engineering department, was history. Edward's face darkened. "Get this on record," he muttered to his assistant, his voice tight with anger. "I want to know exactly how he did this." But the crowd's attention was no longer his to control. Even those who had laughed moments earlier were now looking at Jordan with awe and discomfort, as if realizing they had just mocked a storm before it struck. Emily approached Jordan quietly. "How did you know that sensor was mismatched?" she whispered. Jordan smiled faintly. "Let's just say I've seen this design before." Before Emily could respond, the sound of distant footsteps echoed through the corridor. Slow, steady, deliberate. Conversations faded. Heads turned. The massive doors to the factory floor slid open with a mechanical hiss. A man in his 50s stepped inside, dressed in a gray suit that seemed almost out of place among the industrial chaos. His presence carried a calm authority that drew instant attention. He walked with purpose, every step measured. Edward's assistant approached him, confused. "Sir, this area's restricted." The man raised a hand gently. "Excuse the interruption," he said, his voice firm but polite. "I believe you've been testing my son." The entire room froze. Jordan looked up and smiled. "Dad." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Edward's eyes widened as realization struck. David Carter, the man standing before him, was no ordinary farmer. He was the engineer whose work had laid the foundation for Neoteca's empire. The name DC, whispered for years among old employees as the company's original innovator, was not a myth. It was him. For the first time in his career, Edward Langston had no words. And as the stunned silence settled over the factory floor, everyone knew. The humiliation that began as a cruel joke was about to become the reckoning of a lifetime. For a long, suffocating moment, no one moved. The factory that had been filled with noise and arrogance stood utterly still. The man who had just entered, David Carter, radiated a calm authority that didn't need to be announced. His eyes, steady and unreadable, swept across the crowd before landing on Edward Langston, the CEO who now looked more like a man caught in his own trap than a leader in control. Edward cleared his throat, trying to regain composure. "I'm sorry. And you are?" David opened his briefcase with quiet precision. Inside were stacks of neatly arranged documents, an external drive, and a single manila envelope sealed with Neoteca's logo. "You already know who I am," he said. "But for the sake of your employees, let's remind them." He pulled out a printed contract and placed it on the nearest table. On the top line, clear as daylight, was Edward Langston's signature. The murmurs began immediately, soft at first, then growing louder as employees leaned forward to read. "This," David continued, his tone unwavering, "is the original design agreement for the LX9 automation series, the same system you've been profiting from for the last decade, the same one your company claims was built entirely by your engineering division." Edward's smirk faltered. "That's ridiculous. Those designs were created in-house." David clicked on the external drive, connecting it to the large screen mounted on the wall. The video feed that appeared was grainy but clear enough. It showed Edward, 10 years younger, sitting in an office, shaking hands with a younger David Carter. The video's audio echoed across the hall. "This partnership remains confidential. You'll receive $900,000 in exchange for exclusive rights. You will not disclose this contract or my involvement to anyone." The clip ended with Edward's voice confirming the agreement, his signature clearly visible beneath the terms. The room fell silent again, but this time the air was thick with shock. Employees exchanged horrified glances. The whispers began to rise. "He stole it. He lied. He built everything on someone else's work." Edward's face turned crimson. "That doesn't prove anything," he barked. "This could have been fabricated." David interrupted, his tone calm but cutting. "The patent filings, timestamps, and archived correspondence from your old server say otherwise. You see, Mr. Langston, you forgot one thing. Technology keeps receipts." The crowd erupted with low gasps and murmurs. Edward's control was slipping fast. Then David turned toward the audience, toward every employee who had watched his son be humiliated minutes earlier. "While you were laughing at him," he said softly, "you were laughing at the man who built this company. You mocked his son because of where he came from, not realizing he came from the very hands that made your success possible." Edward tried to interrupt again, but this time, Dr. Emily Zhang stepped forward. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "It's true," she said. "His design notes match the foundation architecture of our current systems. We've all studied his code, we just never knew it was his." A hush swept the room again. David looked at Edward one last time. "You thought you could bury my name, underpay my work, and humiliate my family. You thought race and class would keep us silent. But today, silence ends." At that moment, Jordan stepped forward. He held his phone up, the screen still streaming live to thousands online. The comments flashed like wildfire. #racist CEO, #justice for Carter, #Neotech exposed. The color drained from Edward's face. You were filming this?" Jordan's voice was steady. "The whole world was watching while you mocked me. Now they'll see what kind of empire you built." Edward lunged forward, fury replacing fear. "You can't do this. This is company property." David didn't flinch. "No," he said coldly. "This was built on theft and prejudice. And today that ends." Before Edward could respond, his phone rang. The name flashing on the screen read Board of Directors. He hesitated, then answered, his voice trembling now instead of commanding. What followed was one-sided and brutal. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. When it ended, Edward stood motionless, his hands still gripping the phone. His shoulders slumped. The message was clear. The board had seen enough. In that moment, everything shifted. The mighty CEO, The man who had mocked a boy's worth now stood stripped of his power, surrounded by witnesses who no longer respected him. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was judgment. David turned toward his son, pride glimmering in his eyes. "You did well," he said quietly. "You fixed more than a machine today." But Jordan didn't smile. He looked around, at the faces of workers who had laughed, at Emily who had stayed silent out of fear, at his mother watching from the crowd with tears in her eyes. He didn't feel victorious. He felt something heavier, the weight of what it meant to be right in a world that had already decided you were less. Edward broke the silence one last time. "It was just a joke," he muttered weakly, eyes darting toward the floor. David's response was quiet, but every word was sharp. "Threatening my son's mother's job, mocking him for his skin, stealing from the man who helped you rise. Is that your idea of a joke?" Edward said nothing. The fight was gone from him now. Security entered moments later. The same employees who once laughed at Jordan now stepped aside as Edward Langston, the man who built an empire on lies, was escorted out through the same doors his arrogance had once owned. As the doors closed, Jordan looked at the massive Neotech logo shining above the factory floor, the symbol of everything his father had been denied. He took a deep breath. The machine still hummed steadily behind him, alive and perfect. And in that quiet hum was the sound of justice turning, slow, steady, unstoppable. But this was not the end. Because what came next wasn't just retribution, it was transformation. The next morning, sunlight poured through the glass windows of Neotech's once intimidating headquarters. But something felt different. Lighter, quieter, almost as if the building itself was exhaling after years of holding its breath. The headlines had already spread across the country. CEO exposed for racist conduct and intellectual theft. Farmer's son outsmarts billion-dollar corporation. For Edward Langston, it was the end of a legacy built on arrogance and deceit. But for Jordan and his father, David, it was something far more profound. Not revenge, but restoration. David didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He simply sat with his son outside the factory gates where it all began, the same place where Jordan had once stood humiliated, mocked for his roots. Now, the same crowd that had laughed walked past with quiet respect in their eyes. Some nodded, some apologized silently. Others avoided eye contact, ashamed of how easily they had joined in cruelty disguised as laughter. Jordan didn't say much either. He just kept staring at the sign that read, Neotech. A week ago, it symbolized everything he thought he could never be part of. Now, it was proof that truth could outlast lies, even when the odds felt impossible. The board issued an official apology. Edward was permanently removed from his position. A full internal investigation followed, uncovering years of discriminatory hiring practices and patent misattribution. And when the company released a public statement, they didn't just clear David's name. They credited him as the true original mind behind the LX9 system, reinstating every trace of his erased history. The world saw the headlines and moved on. But for the Carter family, it wasn't just a story. It was the rewriting of decades of pain. That night, David received hundreds of messages from young engineers across the country, many of them minorities, thanking him for standing up, for proving that excellence had no color. Universities invited him to speak. Tech foundations offered to fund scholarships in his name. For the first time in years, the man who had been silenced finally had a voice, and it echoed louder than any machine. Yet, amidst the praise, there was still a quiet ache. Because David knew that for every story like his that surfaced, countless others stayed buried. Unrecorded, unseen, unheard. People whose talents had been dismissed, whose voices were muted by prejudice so casual it passed for normal. One evening, as father and son stood in the empty factory, Jordan turned to him and asked softly, "Was it worth it? All those years of silence?" David looked at the machine that had once symbolized both his creation and his erasure. "It was never silent," he said. It was survival. And survival gives you the chance to speak when it matters most. Jordan nodded, realizing what that meant. That justice wasn't just about being right, it was about being ready when the truth finally had space to breathe. Weeks later, the company held a formal ceremony. Cameras flashed. The board presented David with an award. But instead of keeping it, he turned to Jordan and placed it in his hands. "This belongs to you," he said. "Because you didn't just fix a machine, you fixed what was broken in people's hearts." The audience applauded, some wiping tears, others standing in silence. Because beneath the corporate speeches and public statements, everyone felt it. The weight of a truth that had been buried too long, finally breaking free. Jordan later started a foundation in his father's name, one dedicated to empowering underprivileged youth in STEM, especially those from rural and marginalized backgrounds. He wanted to make sure no one's brilliance would ever go unseen again just because of where they came from or the color of their skin. And in time, that foundation became bigger than Neotech itself. But perhaps the most powerful change wasn't on a global scale. It was in the small things, in the way people at the factory treated each other, in the quiet apologies that turned into real change, in the awareness that prejudice didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered in boardrooms and hiring forms. David never returned to Neotech again. He didn't need to. His legacy was already living through the very system they once tried to erase him from. And as the camera fades to black, we see Jordan walking past the old factory, now carrying his father's old tool bag, the same one he once used to fix that machine. He glances back one last time. The machine hums softly behind him, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof that truth, no matter how long it's buried, finds its way back to the surface. Because racism may silence voices for a time, but it cannot silence legacy. Because no matter how powerful the lie, it always trembles before the truth. And as you watch this story, ask yourself, how many voices around us are still being ignored, simply because of who they are or where they come from? If the story moved you, don't just feel it. Share it. Because every share, every comment, every act of awareness keeps stories like this from being forgotten. And maybe one day, stories like this won't need to be told anymore. And now, I want to hear from you. What did you feel when you saw how the Carter family turned humiliation into triumph? Have you ever been judged or underestimated because of where you came from or what you looked like? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your voice matters more than you think. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real, powerful stories that prove one thing. True worth always rises above prejudice.